Rudy is our artist in residence this week, working with music students and faculty throughout the week. He arrived Monday and he leaves Saturday morning. So he's involved in a number of activities this week with the music department and the Institute of International Studies. He's giving this presentation and then one tomorrow at 1 o'clock here on voodoo from the Caribbean region. And then on Friday evening, he is working with the Southern Symphony Orchestra to present a concert titled Caribbean Adventures at 7:30, and that concert will not be on campus, but it will be at the Central Christian Center in downtown Joplin. The address is 410 South Virginia Avenue, and so that concert is open to the public, and so that's one reason that they're having it off campus. That's a very nice venue downtown, the old Fox Theater. So don't forget 1 o'clock tomorrow here, 7:30 Friday, downtown Joplin. So Rudy is the director of orchestras and a professor of music, as I said, at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He coaches chamber music, conducts both the symphony and chamber orchestras, and teaches violin, viola, and graduate conducting classes. He was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He earned his master's degree in violin performance from Temple University. He has guest conducted numerous ensembles in Trinidad, Cuba, Panama, France, Sweden, Russia, Haiti, Brazil, Italy, and Turkey. What a repertoire he has as a guest conductor. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jean Rudy Perrault to Missouri Southern.
Thank you very much. So I've been informed that some of you have classes and you may need to bug out of here. I won't take that personally. And well, good morning, and I'll try to speak as quickly as I can because we have a lot to cover, and my original timing was 50 minutes, so we are already 10 minutes behind. So let's boogie. I'm grateful to be here today and would like to publicly thank Dr. Canis Nicolau, who is my former student and orchestra director here at this fine institution, and Dr. Chad Stebbins for this invitation. This topic today took on new meaning for me this past week when I was informed that one of my colleagues, a composer, conductor, teacher, mentor, friend, and all-around wonderful human being passed away a week ago Sunday. And with your permission, I would like to dedicate this talk to him, to his memory, and ask for a brief moment of silence because I know we are short on time. Thank you. Now, as far back as the 2300s BC, we know that women had been making their marks in classical music. Yet, if asked to name 10 women composers, most music students and perhaps even faculty would have difficulty coming up with those names. This becomes even more taxing if asked to name 10 African-American women composers. Here's a partial list of African-American women composers. I must admit that before my interest in the works of Shirley Graham Du Bois, wife of famed W.E.B. Du Bois, I would have been in the same boat as many of you. During my research for this talk, I could come up with maybe just 50. Let's put a pin on that, and we will come back for the reason behind this low number. Let's expand the list a little bit more. Can you think of 10 composers, men or women, of African descent, not just African-American composers? Now, given the short number and being short on time, we will not go through the process of you naming those 10 composers. I will not put you on the spot right now. But let's go a step further. Can you think of 10 composers, again, men or women, of African descent born in the Caribbean? If you are able to come up with even 5 names, you are part of a very exclusive club. Hopefully, before the evening is out, most of you will also join that club. Now, Now that we've spent a little bit of time in the trenches, so to speak, let's go back out to that 20,000-foot view. The central question of this lecture today is, why don't we know more about Caribbean composers? The answer would be quite obvious to all. Because classical music has been dominated, dictated, controlled by white men. I have oversimplified it. I've simplified this answer, but at the root of the anonymity of those composers, it really is that simple. There are layers upon layers of issues that to expose before we can find a solution. This short lecture will serve as a catalyst for further discussions on this topic. I teach my students that luck is the intersection of means and opportunity. Those are the two ingredients for success. With a healthy dose of perseverance, work ethics, stick-to-itness, one only needs an opportunity to present itself to capitalize on it and bring about success. If you have one but not the other, it is that much more difficult to achieve success. Your chances of achieving that success are drastically reduced. Remove both of those ingredients, and any lingering possibility of success is gone. But then, I must admit, there are also those who, against all odds, manage to carve out all their success. Now, I'm skipping a lot of stuff because it's not quite as relevant, and I want to get to the heart of the matter. Earlier, I asked you to put a pin on the small number of African American composers. Let's begin to unpack that a little bit. In late July, and this was easy to miss with all of the COVID-19 coverage, the New York Times ran an article on Joseph Boulange. He was the son of a wealthy plantation owner who had settled on the island of Guadeloupe, one of the Caribbean islands. As the son of the wealthy landowner, Joseph Boulange was afforded certain privileges, but having an enslaved Afro-Guadeloupean mother, there were certain limits to his privileges. Around the age of 10, Joseph traveled with his parents to France, just begun his, shall we say, refinement. He was enrolled at an elite school and received a well-rounded education that included music and other art forms and sport. He was quite the athlete and became a champion fencer. His flair and effortless ability to defeat his opponents caught the attention of Louis XV, who would later defy the Code Noir and name him Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Code Noir, what is that? The Code Noir, or Black Code. It was instituted by the earlier Louis XIV in 1685. It's a decree that restricted the benefits afforded certain non-white citizens. You can read between the lines here. The Chevalier de Saint-Georges name stuck to the chagrin of many in the French court. He became the leader of the Légion Saint-Georges, the first all-black military squad in France and perhaps even all of Europe, fighting for equality and against France's slave trade laws. Boulange's exploits were legendary and even reached the ears of John Adams in the Americas, clear across the Atlantic. Little is known about his musical education, but we know for sure that come 1770, he became prominent with his two violin sonatas, and especially the two violin concerti. His standing and popularity in the music field would later earn him the directorship of the Académie Royale de Musique. Then came trouble. We're not talking about the John Lewis good trouble kind, but related. Even in enlightened and civilized Paris, La Ville des Lumières, the city of light, musicians refused to take orders from a mulatto. Joseph Boulange persevered and would later form the Concert de la Loge Olympique, which would become France's best and best known orchestra. The increased pigmentation of his skin interfered with more success. More racial hostility would force Joseph Boulange to become an activist and give up many of his musical dreams. He would die in his 50s, a much more reduced man than from his glory days just 2 decades earlier. Today, along with his title of Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Joseph Boulange has also been nicknamed the Black Mozart for the striking similarity between the two composers. A side note here. In my view, many of those nicknames, and we will see that over and over, notably with Ludovic Lamotte, the Haitian pianist, he was dubbed the Black Chopin. All of those nicknames often sting as an effort to diminish a black or brown composer by elevating the apparent superiority of a white one. Never mind that in this case, Boulange was 11 years older than the young Wolfgang. Those of you who will be logging in or attending in person the upcoming concert this Friday will have an opportunity to hear one of Chevalier de Saint-Georges' symphony in its entirety. But in case you have something else on your plate that day, here is a small sample of Boulange music performed by the Musai Remix Ensemble in Portland, Oregon. My apologies to all of the purists out there for stopping in the dominant key. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it won't bother you. We have just peeled off the outer layer of this onion. Surely, it is the most obvious and egregious, but it may perhaps be the hardest to stomach or shed, depending on which side of the tracks you happen to be. Today, the question of race is front and center, and it seems to dominate every conversation circle, and rightly so. The next few layers are not as apparent. Who are the judges, juries, and executioners? How do we define classical music? What lens is the music of Caribbean composers being judged with? Can you keep your identity as a Caribbean composer and succeed? What are the instruments available? What are the major hurdles facing most non-white artists, Caribbean composers specifically? What is being done to repair the harm caused by centuries of neglect and dismissive behavior, such as access to music education, cultural events, achievement gap, economic gap, geographic isolation, lack of role model, etc., etc. Much of those issues are beyond the purview of this talk and would take way too long to connect the dots. Judge, jury, and executioner. I mentioned earlier that for centuries, classical music was dominated by white men. Rules were set in place to prevent others, women or non-white, entry into this exclusive club. Though most women were given a rudimentary education in music, the rationale was not for them to pursue it as a profession, and certainly not to compete with their male counterparts. A woman who showed aptitude for an instrument was put on display as part of their entertainment, or better yet, to enhance her dowry. Once she had secured her husband, in many cases elevated her social status, she was to use her talent to entertain and please her husband and his friends. Not anymore. Yet, as you can see, I will show you a long list of women composers later. To borrow from Maya Angelou's poem, Still They Rose. It is a bit more complicated if you happen to be non-white with little access to music education. In the plantation days, slaves were not formally trained in music, so they were left to figure it out on their own, but on their own time. Those who successfully learned to play an instrument might have been given certain privileges, entertaining the master and his friends in the big house, and spared from hard labor. Jury. The type of music they sung, what we know as the Negro spirituals, would never be taken seriously or deemed worthy of the stage if it weren't for a certain well-known composer copying their style and ethos to come up with his own melody. His pupils added the title and words to the tune, Going Home, et voila. We have one of the most iconic melodies. In this setting, this melody, equally as soulful as its Negro counterparts, quickly climbed to the chart to become one of the most recognizable melodies. The point here is that that style of music had been around for some time, but it took a complete foreigner's homesickness to see their value, come up with his own version and use it in one of his symphonies. Though Dvorak was heavily criticized at the time for using what sounded like slave melodies in his New World Symphony, it was that seal of approval from Dvorak that allowed for that genre to be elevated for the stage. Before that, they were just barbaric melodies that slaves sung to themselves to pass the time, entertain and comfort each other, or remind themselves of their native land. A side note here. When you hear the words naive or native art used to describe a piece of art, whether it be a painting, a sculpture, or a composition, some folks may choose to see it as a term of endearment or simply as a geographical descriptor. But most will agree that there is quite a bit more to reveal. Those two tiny words may not be as innocent as they appear. In my opinion, they are code for primitive, unsophisticated, unpolished, lacking depth. Of course, this all rests on the narrow lens used to define what should be considered classical music. Executioner. Though a few slaves became quite proficient on instruments reserved for European descendants, the thought that a slave would join an ensemble of similarly qualified white players would have been totally unacceptable. Not keeping your place in the world or technically surpassing a white player would be a punishable offense. As a result, orchestras were kept quite homogeneous for centuries. In fact, it was not until 1997 that we finally rid ourselves of that long, homogeneously white sexist membership of a major orchestra, the Vienna Phil. Our record on ethnic diversity in a major orchestra is equally abysmal. To understand this lack of diversity in today's orchestra, we must go way back to the colonies. In the Caribbean, there was a long history of suffocating, repressing, punishing, threatening any slave who even thought that they were equal to or better than any white person. This segregationist and terrorist attitude, but even more important, the impunity with which they were allowed to keep their proverbial knee on the social justice scale, ensured that slaves and their descendants would continue to be denied access to any form of education or self-elevation, be treated worse than cattle, or in the best of worlds, be subjugated to second-class citizenry. It will come as no surprise then that, much like academia, change in classical music moves at a glacial pace. Unless confronted with a moment in time that threatens its survival. So it is that it took the very situation that we are in to force us to reassess our future and how we might possibly survive this new environment. Let me point out that this is not a new phenomenon. We, and I'm including myself in all this, we have known this for a while. Classical music in its last format had been losing the fight to retain its subscribers and patrons. We have known for some time that we needed to do something different. We needed to do something about it. The writing was very clearly written on every wall. But we were too scared to upset the apple cart and be bold. Major orchestras have taken baby steps, including adding new music in their programming, but fell short of educating their audience so that they too could enjoy this ride along with them. With COVID-19, we in the academic world had to quickly adapt and change the delivery of our courses. Similarly, performing organizations across the globe are coming to grips with their new reality. They are fighting for their survival and re-examining how to stay afloat in this socially distanced world. The status quo no longer applies. I say all this because this presents a unique opportunity to reinvent ourselves. With many performance organizations shifting their seasons to streaming for the foreseeable future and figuring out how to charge for this virtual concert hall service for a fee, returning to the standard repertoire, what many of my students will call a bunch of dead white guys, will lose its appeal very quickly. The live feel cannot be replicated in the virtual world. The power of that sound washing over you, 100 or so musicians playing together, tugging at the emotional strings, that might come back someday. But for now, we need to worry about how we will survive until the time that we are able to pack a concert hall and enjoy this experience together. But for now, we will be depending on our internet service not to drop. Before I get off my soapbox here, let us take a moment and be truly honest with ourselves. Picture your affluent donor, your affluent patron logging in to catch the live stream performance on their state-of-the-art screen and audio system for a fee. How long do you suppose this will last? As wonderful as they are, where is the appeal of another Brahms symphony being streamed online for a fee when you can simply YouTube a video of that same symphony with your choice of conductor or orchestra? Only the nerds like myself and perhaps some of you will tune in for a new interpretation. That market is fairly small and couldn't possibly keep an orchestra budget in the black. How do we define classical music? What metrics are used to make that determination? Who decides how those metrics are used? The Oxford Dictionary defines it as music written in a Western musical tradition, usually using an established form, for example, a symphony. Classical music is generally considered to be serious and to have a lasting value. The key here, no pun intended, is Western musical tradition. But there's also the loophole, usually, that is yet to be explored fully. Other sides were equally vague. For example, one stipulated that it is music that is considered to be part of a long, formal tradition and to have lasting value. And then there's the more restricted definition of classical music as music written within a time period. I'm not going to bore you with more definition, but suffice to say that I was not given a satisfactory answer, which I'll translate as, if I can make a case for it, then it should count. Moving forward, I will simply refer to any music that I believe fits those criteria as art music. So here's my pitch. We have an opportunity to present new works, new sounds, new approaches to compositions, new instruments, and make use of new technology. In this next phase, I will present a sampling of Caribbean composers and discuss their appeal and what makes them different and unique. We are short on time, so I'm going to go as quickly as I can, and perhaps even cutting up some of the pieces halfway through so we can catch up. If you need to discuss any of those things, meet me later, and I'll be glad to discuss that further. All right, now for the fun part. We will get to sample the music of some of those composers. You'll hear a variety of works, some for solo piano, others for chamber ensemble, string ensemble, symphony orchestra, vocal ensemble. Much like composers from other cultures, Caribbean composers are equally versatile and do not limit themselves to a single method or genre. There are exceptions to this rule, though. Some composers seem to have chosen to write for their preferred instrument, for a single instrument or vocal combination, but they still present a wide breadth of colors and style. A word of caution here. This is a really gross generalization for the purpose of this talk. There is no one-size-fits-all. And one final disclaimer. The term emerging composers will be used in its broadest possible definition. It's not going to be restricted to the young upstarts. There are composers for centuries past that are only now getting a second chance. Joseph Boulange was one of such composers. Boulange music was more readily accepted because it followed the natural progression of classical music. I like to think of composers in four groups. There are the composers who studied abroad and whose writing would either emulate the Western musical tradition or return to their roots armed with compositional techniques learned abroad. There is also another group who either studied at home or are self-taught. They too would either emulate the Western musical tradition as they heard it or stayed in touch with the sound of their native land. Again, a broad generalization for the sake of time. You will certainly detect some different styles. Music of Curacao and Aruba. Those tiny Dutch colonies are populated by less than 300,000 people in a combined area of 250 square miles. By comparison, the smallest state in the US, Rhode Island, is 1,200 square miles, with a population of 1.1 million people. The art music of Aruba and Curacao is dominated mostly by waltzes, with a tropical twist. One of the most celebrated composers is Wim Statius Müller, born in 1930 and recently passed in 2019. The piece opens in a typical mazurka-esque style, but then it turns the corner with its second theme, and suddenly you find yourselves by the beach sipping a rum cocktail if you're of age. The left hand gives a subtle hint of traditional drumming. This is a technique you'll find replicated time and time again, especially in works for solo piano. Unfortunately, we got to move on. Earlier, I mentioned that Caribbean composers are versatile and indistinguishable at times from their European counterparts. Here is a perfect example. Dominique Lejean, born and raised in Trinidad, had a passion for pen music in her early years. She played in a school steel pen orchestra and even wrote calypso, the traditional popular music of Trinidad. She went on to study composition and film scoring in the UK. Over the years, she has composed for multiple projects, including writing the score for all 38 Shakespeare's plays. The piece that we will hear a portion of evokes Barber, Sondheim, and many other composers who have influence her writing. Ms. Lejean also writes with the sound of a native Trinidad. A quick survey of her discography will reveal a composer with a large palette of sound, style, and texture. So, to answer your question, can you keep your identity as a Caribbean composer and succeed? If we examine Ms. Lejean's path, the answer seems to be yes. But must one make it as a regular composer first? Must there be a proving ground, so to speak? We will explore this question later. For now, here is music by Dominique Lejean for voice and piano, selection from White Egrets. And I may have to cut it again to catch up. My apologies to Dominique Lejean, but we must move on. I would be remiss if I didn't include Trinidad and Tobago's most famous instrument, the steel pan. Which brings us to the next roadblock, availability of instruments, and the reluctance to accept the steel pan, an instrument that was not invented by a dead European person on the world stage. The sound of the steel pan automatically brings you to sun and fun, colorful clothing, carnival, elaborate costumes, sweaty bodies dancing without a care in the world. Is the pan an appropriate instrument for the stage? I would argue that if Bach had heard the sound of the pan back in 1721 when he was writing the Brandenburg Concerti, he might have found a use for it. But for now, to bring legitimacy to that instrument, we will have to resign ourselves to arrangement of saint composer. I'm sorry. I know you want to hear the rest of it. The internet can be a wonderful place, so go forth and search. Music of Guadeloupe. With a population of under 400,000, Guadeloupe is nearly 630 square miles, so half the size of Rhode Island. The island has no conservatory, no professional orchestras. Composers from this island are partial to the ballroom dances, and I quote here, reinvented in a Creole tradition, quadrilles, waltzes, begins, and mazurkas, as cited by Christine Gengelhoff. By far, Chevalier de Saint-Georges is the most celebrated composer. He is a national treasure. An ensemble, the Ensemble Instrumental Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was formed and regularly performs his music. They even have a music festival named after him, the Saint-Georges International Music Festival. Check it out. From the small sample that we had heard earlier, in the harmonies, key relationships, instrumentation, form, nothing strayed much from what many of his contemporaries were also writing. Though a unique qualifier of the music of Boulange, especially the violin concerti, is the more technical aspects of those works. Another notable composer from Guadeloupe, who composed mostly for piano, is Alain-Pierre Pradel. Mr. Pradel seeks to unite the classical sounds with the local airs of his native Guadeloupe. Here's a sample of Pradel's music. Pomme Cannelle is written in rondo form. For the non-geeks out there, it signifies that a theme, call it theme A, keeps returning after each contrasting interlude. So we'll have A, then theme B, and then theme A comes back, then C, and then A, and then so on and so forth. A form used by countless classical composers. What gives this its island flavor resides in the treatment of the left hand. Now, if you can remember back to Statius Müller, the imitation of a slow Jan Valou. And if you want to know about Jan Valou, Dr. Nicolas will tell you more about it some other time. So here's Pomme Cannelle. This is theme B. Back to theme A. And it does go on to C and then D and everything, but we've got to move on. Sorry, folks. Sorry to be so quick on this. We will have to spend a little bit more time sampling the music of Haiti. There's a wide range of styles and influences in Haitian art form, ranging from the neoclassical to avant-garde to film music. There is a little bit for all tastes. A good majority of composers wrote for their primary instruments, but many took a leap of faith and ventured far out of their comfort zones. I found it difficult to pigeonhole Haitian classical composers, even in the broadest generalization. So I'll try to give you different styles, instrumentation, or size of the group. Haiti has seen a steady stream of classical composers over the years, writing in all kinds of styles. From the piano music of Ludovic Lamotte to the military marches of Auxil Gentil. The last few years especially, there has been a huge surge of young composers taking up the challenge. Many are self-taught or depend on the generosity of foreigners to receive some valuable summer instruction of help. Sabrina Jean-Louis Clair de Lune, meaning moonlight, written in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. This piece, written for string ensemble, reflects the innocence of a young lady when she was just 14. The harmony is very wholesome and peaceful, in sharp contrast to the deadly earthquake that devastated the country. Sabrina was self-taught around the time that she wrote this piece. In an interview, she mentioned that when she composes, she simply hears the sound in her head and writes it down. It shows an unusual level of sophistication and understanding of string instrument for a young composer. She has since made major strides. Sabrina relies on a deep faith to guide her writing. Here is Clair de Lune. Let's go back to the question, must one make it as a regular composer before making it as a Caribbean composer? The answer is, it depends. Of course, there's the question of training, talent, and persistence. Let me say right off the bat that so-called regular composers do not have it easy either, oh no. I know many who check all the privileged boxes and yet live in obscurity. The issue is it harder for a Caribbean composer? We learned at the beginning of this talk that women with plenty of talent and training have been denied the opportunity simply for the fact that they were of the wrong gender. Society would not bear seeing a woman in a man's role. That was totally unacceptable. Times have changed, thankfully. Women are still being stigmatized somewhat, but they're slowly breaking that glass ceiling. The fight is equally hard for Caribbean composers, especially those with a certain pigmentation. It's a compounded problem if you are a woman of a certain color. Women, they have studied in the best schools. They have worked hard at their craft, but it simply is rare to hear their music played by major ensemble, unless you can find a niche. William Dawson, an African-American composer and musicologist, said, "I have tried not to imitate Beethoven or Brahms, Franck, or Ravel, but to just be myself, a Negro. To me, the finest compliment that could be paid to my symphony when it has its premiere is that it unmistakably is not the work of a white man. I want the audience to say, only a Negro could have written that." So if your goal is precisely to set yourself apart from the European counterparts, then there is a treasure trove of melodies in the Negro spirituals. Even Dvorak has urged his American students that, and I quote, "The future of this country must be founded upon what are called the Negro melodies. This must be the real foundation of any serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States." One of the many composers writing choral music is a young man by the name of Sidney Guillaume. His writing is modeled after another Haitian composer, Émile Desamours, who spent most of his life in Haiti writing for choral ensembles, using folk and traditional melodies. In his own words, Sidney wants to, and I quote, "foster an awareness of the beautiful Haitian culture and continue to serve as an ambassador for his native country." Sidney is now a rising star in the vocal ensemble world, and you will hear why. Here is his Carnaval, as performed by the Maine All-State Choir. Let's move on. Music of Jamaica. Peter Ashborn is probably the best Jamaican composer of his generation. He studied at the Berklee School of Music, College of Music, receiving a degree in composition. With a great number of jingles to his credit, Ashborn has demonstrated that he is equally at ease writing in the commercial world as he is in a formal classical tradition. The piece that we are about to hear, 5 seconds, is an excerpt from his last major composition, 5 Jamaican songs. In this piece, he uses the Jamaican folk songs as his muse. We must move. Music of Cuba. The many experiences and influences in her life have made Tanya Leon one of the best living composers from the Caribbean. Tanya Leon is, or should be, a household name. She has been honored and profiled by all of the major networks for her teaching, advocacy for the arts, conducting and advisory roles for arts organizations. Her compositions deserve much more attention than they are given. The rich mix of cultures in her native Cuba, African and Latin rhythms, traditional drumming, santeria, and jazz, all come into play in this next selection. This was a piece written for the Dance Theater of Harlem. Whereas Tanya Leon drew heavily on African roots in that last piece, Paquito de Rivera relied on the indigenous tradition of Cuba and added a dash of his jazz background to pull off this jam. It's complex, driven, and a heck of a lot of fun to perform. Paquito is well known in the jazz world. He is equally comfortable in the classical medium as he is in the jazz. The genius of so many of his compositions is that perfect fusion of genres, working seamlessly. For the final piece of this segment of the talk, here is Paquito de Rivera famed Wapango, performed by the Turtle Island String Quartet. Sorry, Wapango, Google it, fun. You may have noticed that after the few examples, I moved away from clearly identifying what makes a composition Caribbean. This was by design. My point is the same that I made earlier in this talk. The ethnicity of a composer cannot be determined simply by listening to it or by playing it, by playing his or her compositions, unless the goal is precisely that, to be identified as such. So, how is it that talented Caribbean composers are still struggling to find an audience? This question was asked of Undine Smith Moore, African-American composer. She replied that she had, and I quote, "no early contact with anyone who knew how to go about getting anything published. Worse still, she would, by her position as a black child, have automatically assumed that this was not intended for her, even if she had heard it discussed." She continues that, I quote, "she cannot logically blame the publishers for not publishing works which were never submitted, but she can blame a society which educated her to feel her otherness, that left her ignorant of that which was accessible to those of the dominant group with similar talent," end quote. This gets to the larger question, the larger discussion of centuries of neglect and dismissive behavior, such as access to music education, cultural achievement guide, and all of that, that we simply cannot unpack right now. In his 2013 dissertation abstract, Mark Lorax wrote, and I quote, "art music composers of African descent have composed works for symphonies and chamber ensembles for more than a century. They are as comfortable speaking in the musical language of Europe as they are speaking in the vernacular languages of blues, gospel, jazz, R&B, and hip-hop." The American poet Nikki Giovanni wrote, "We are all imprisoned in the castle of our skins. Once we learn to accept our past and the sins of our ancestors, we will be better placed to accept and celebrate our differences." I'm truly glad to be a part of this festival. What a wonderful initiative it is to explore a corner of the world every year. I commend the festival organizers and for their vision and their hundreds of individuals tirelessly working behind the scenes to make this vision a reality. It is only this sort of teamwork pulling together in the same direction that will ensure that Caribbean composers will be judged solely by the merit of their work. As closing, I would like to play a piece by my mentor that I mentioned earlier, Julio Racine. This is Tangente au Yanvalou for flute. And I welcome your questions later.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.